kind enough to give us a couple minutes here to break down everything that's been happening in Georgia with the motion against Fani Willis, all the latest on the RICO stuff with the former president Donald Trump. Tamar Hallerman is joining us here from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's also the co-host of Breakdown, fantastic podcast. You can go listen to it wherever you get your pods. Tamar, Mike, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I've been following you a lot. You and I were talking about this off air. I've been following you truly. I think I reached out to you when the first indictments actually broke out, and you were like, "Hey, I'm a little busy right now, so let's table this discussion for later on." And I couldn't blame you at that point. But since then, maybe the audience, our audience, from a national perspective, has not been following what's been happening in Georgia. We've seen a little bit of this motion that was filed by one of the defendant's attorneys against Fani Willis for this inappropriate relationship that she was having with the special prosecutor, which she appointed to help her in this case. Summation that I just gave aside, can you kind of take our audience overview, 30,000-foot overview of what the motion was about and kind of what's the latest in this motion and when we expect an actual decision from the judge on it?
So this motion from defendant Mike Roman, who really was one of the lowest profile defendants in this case, he was a former Trump campaign official, worked in the White House under Donald Trump. And it really has brought the rest of this case pretty much to a standstill. We were moving along with pretrial motions. We were starting to talk about when a potential trial could begin. The DA's office wanted that to begin in August. But right now, all of that, everyone's just kind of waiting for Judge Scott McAfee to rule on this motion from Mike Roman. Now, he's alleging that this relationship, which in and of itself is not necessarily enough to get a prosecutor disqualified, but the meat of this allegation is that DA Fani Willis improperly benefited financially from this Trump case because of her relationship with Nathan Wade, the special prosecutor who's overseeing this case. Michael Roman points to trips that Nathan Wade took the DA on to places like Napa Valley, the Caribbean, cruises they've been on. And he says that is enough to show that the DA has been enriching herself off the case. And he's arguing that because of that, the entire DA's office should be pulled from this case, should be removed and disqualified. Not only that, he's asking for Judge Scott McAfee to have the charges against him dismissed, which seems like a much less likely thing to occur. And so we've been duking this out for the last 6 weeks or so. It took the DA's office more than 3 weeks to respond to all of this. They acknowledged that they had been in a relationship, Fani Willis and Nathan Wade, but they have denied that they did anything wrong. They said that they paid for travel expenses roughly equally and accused Mike Roman's attorney of lying about them and basically picking around in their personal lives to make this a political circus and not necessarily something that had legal standing. There was a pretty extraordinary evidentiary hearing here last week, which I know a lot of news networks carried live, where DA Fani Willis took the stand pretty unexpectedly. And we're waiting to hear from next steps from the judge.
Yeah, that was some testimony for people that did not see this. You know, she was watching it in her office. She decided to go down to the courthouse and testify according to her and what she said. There's so many different directions and follow-ups from kind of what you said. I want to get into the relationship and whether or not it was appropriate or not, and like kind of what some of the motion is alleging and what they've testified about. But kind of on the surface, again, high level for all our audience here, if this motion is upheld, and let's say she is disqualified. You already mentioned that they wanted to start this trial in August. What's the delay look like? Like, how do you get another prosecution office to oversee this case? Take our audience kind of through those steps and legal hurdles.
It would be a significant delay if the Fulton DA's office is removed from this case. Things would move to a nonpartisan state agency called the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia. This group is almost like a trade association for prosecutors around the state. They help them with training. They're how a lot of prosecutors get money from the state house, and they really kind of help all these 50 DA's offices around the state run and continuing education, resources, that sort of thing. And it could take a good long while before another special prosecutor might be appointed. And we know this because this DA's office back in July 2022 was disqualified from investigating one of their main targets. This man, Burt Jones, is now Georgia's lieutenant governor. At the time, he was a state senator who was running for that position. He was under the microscope for his role as a Trump elector. A judge ruled that the DA had a conflict of interest, couldn't investigate him, appointed the prosecuting attorney's counsel to decide what to do next. And it's been more than a year and a half, and the council hasn't announced its next steps, if it plans to say no further investigation is needed, whether it wants to appoint someone else. And so it's possible it could take a very long time if the Fulton DA's office is disqualified. And not only that, there's a real question of what other prosecutor would want to take this case. First of all, it is a monster case that requires a lot of resources. There's something like a dozen DAs working on this case in Fulton, which is bigger than the offices of a lot of prosecuting of DAs offices around the state. Some only have 4 or 5 prosecutors. So a lot of people won't want to take this. A lot of people wouldn't want the political microscope that a case like this would bring. And so there really leaves only a handful of offices that would ever consider taking this. And I think given all of this nasty attention that DA Fani Willis has gotten, I think it raises real questions about who might want to take this case. So a lot of the DA's allies believe that if the Fulton DA's office is disqualified, that this case is all but dead. We don't necessarily know that to be true. They could find somebody who wants to take this, but it's also possible the next prosecutor might want to charge it in a different way. Maybe they don't want to look at racketeering laws and do something more narrowly tailored. Or maybe they appoint somebody who decides, I don't think there's a there, let's drop this case.
That's actually very important to note. And didn't know some of that stuff. And again, this is why we have folks like you on. I did want to ask you, because you just said political microscope, and it just got me into this follow-up. So allow me to have a soliloquy here for a second here, Tamar. When you're shooting at the king, you best not miss is always kind of the proverbial phrase that's thrown around here. And when you're trying to prosecute a former president, we haven't had that in our nation's history. You would think that all of the I's would be dotted and the T's would be crossed. You kind of mentioned a little bit about the Burt Jones stuff and the semi-messiness, let's call it, for lack of a better term, of Fani Willis's office. Let's get into the relationship and what the heart of the motion is. Are you hearing from people there in the state that are like, because she said this in her testimony, the trial is now about me and my relationship and not about, the former president and the RICO charges. Yeah, whose fault is that? That's yours. What are you hearing from people within the prosecution office or people in the state about how messy this looks, that their relationship, even though, again, personal side, nothing illegally performed, it gives the allure and appearance and now fodder for the former president who's out there with his folks saying, look, this is politically motivated. They were sleeping with each other. What are you hearing from people within the state about how messy this kind of looks on the inside?
It very much depends on who you talk to. I think there's a lot of supporters of the DA who say, look, is it advisable that she was seeing her top deputy on this case? No, it's a bad look. But a lot of them believe that there's not enough that rises to the level of disqualification, and they feel like it's very unfair, the amount of attention the DA has gotten, and especially just the image at this hearing of this series of white male defense attorneys going after a Black woman, the first woman to hold the Fulton DA's job ever, prying into her sex life. A lot of people say that is nasty and uncalled for, and a white man would not be put under the same political microscope, as I called it. But then there are plenty of other people who are just saying, what was she thinking? This smell, this stinks to high heaven. This is wrong and she should be removed. Even if it's not illegal in and of itself, some people say exactly what you did, Mike, that if you're going to go after the former president, you better have all of your ducks in a row. And this was a massive error in judgment, so much so that the DA should step aside, either for the sake of saving this investigation or to get rid of it and focus on some of the issues that they believe the Fulton DA's office should be focused on, like punishing violent crime and working their way through the COVID backlog of all these thousands of cases that have been sitting here. So it's very much an eye of the beholder kind of thing. And I think this hearing last week, at least as I've talked to folks, I think it really reinforced people's attitudes one way or another. If you loved the DA, you thought that she did a great job defending herself and took a lot of these issues off the table with her testimony. If you don't like her, you were talking about how embarrassing this hearing was and how it's just proof that Judge McAfee should disqualify the DA's office.
It's like you said, eye of the beholder is really well said, because I've been hearing so many different takes, including my own on television, talking about this case. I feel like I know a lot about it, but maybe our audience, like I said, hasn't been following it. So let's stay on the case itself. Let's say the motion is denied, or we already talked about this scenario where it's upheld and now where it goes to. So the motion's denied, and now the case is resuming. Can you kind of give us the latest on the case, the people that have already settled with the DA's office, who would actually be charged? Could we actually get this thing up and running before August? I've talked to former Trump lawyers that have said some of these cases, thousands of documents, like you said, the manpower to be able to go through that and discovery would take forever to, try to do something in August. I'm assuming that the same would be held here, but tell us a little bit about this motion is denied now. Where do we go from here? And would we actually start in August?
Well, at this point, the judge has been working his way through what are called pretrial motions, which is how this motion to disqualify the DA came up. And he's been kind of systematically working his way through them, kind of clearing the decks, getting ready ahead of the trial. The DA's office wanted to begin in August, but that was looking unlikely even before this giant wrench was thrown into things, especially just given not only all of these other criminal cases that have been lodged against the former president and all this time in court Trump is going to be spending in places like New York, Florida, Washington. There's questions about presidential immunity in the January 6th case that Jack Smith is doing in Washington. The set of issues in front of the Supreme Court now, or at least that they're waiting for them to review, are quite similar to some of the issues that are going to pop up here locally in Fulton County. So a lot of the lawyers I spoke to believe that the judge is going to want to wait for the Supreme Court to weigh in on the federal case before deciding what he wants to do on the state case. So it was looking less and less likely that August was going to be the start date. And then, of course, you start getting into the political calendar. The proposed start date that prosecutors wanted in August was 3 weeks after the Republican convention, when at this point it's looking that Donald Trump is going to have the Republican nomination and the campaign cycle really gets into high gear. It is looking less and less likely that a case, at least if it started this year, is not going to be resolved by the end of the year. As to where we are, the case back in August, when an indictment was handed up, there were 19 original defendants. We are now down to 15 because of 4 plea agreements that were struck with 4 defendants earlier this fall. Among them were Sidney Powell, an attorney briefly affiliated with the Trump campaign, Ken Chesbrough and Jenna Ellis, 2 other attorneys who were working for the Trump campaign, as well as Scott Hall, who was a bail bondsman here in Atlanta, who was very involved with the effort in Coffee County in South Georgia to copy sensitive election data. They are now cooperating with prosecutors, and it's possible they could be called to testify in this upcoming trial, whenever that may be. So that's where we are. But until this question of disqualification gets resolved, everything is sort of suspended in the air at this point.
Georgia, well, first off, to quote Ray Charles, it's on my mind right now because there's so much going on with all of these cases. And obviously, this has kind of been at the forefront for folks about the Fani Willis stuff. And then obviously, we've covered here on the show, as you've covered as well, the phone call to then Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, find me the 11,000 votes. I did want to ask you about one state official that's still in power there, and that's the governor in Brian Kemp. In all of this, I know he recently testified, or at least it came out that he had testified to Special Counsel Jack Smith and gave some testimony to him about the election interference. He's been asked about this as well. What are you hearing from the governor's office, or what have we been hearing from Brian Kemp publicly about this case? If we get into like the nitty gritty of this case, who would be called from his office? Would he actually be called to testify in this RICO indictment against the former president?
Yeah, Governor Kemp has had an interesting relationship in all of this because he's expected to be a star witness in this case. And he's had a bit of an been put in an uncomfortable situation as part of all of this, where he's definitely not a Donald Trump fan. He's kind of kept him at arm's length, voted for him, but was definitely pressured by him in the aftermath of the 2020 election to take steps that he was not comfortable taking to revisit the election results here in Georgia. He testified before a special grand jury that helped advise DA Willis on this case back in 2022, but he really fought his subpoena to come in and testify. Initially, it appears that there had been some cooperation between his office and prosecutors, but there was a massive communications breakdown. They felt like one of his top aides was being mistreated by Nathan Wade specifically, and a fight that kind of spilled out into public view. That said, he testified. It seemed pretty normal. And in the meantime, especially over the last year, he's been one of the top Republicans who's really pushed back as Republicans. Before all of this relationship stuff came out, many Republicans were still targeting the DA for this case. They felt like it was nakedly political, that she should be punished for going after Donald Trump. And he was one of the loudest Republicans who said, I may not love what she's doing, but she hasn't done anything wrong. We need to focus on other things to make Georgia a better place. But especially since these allegations and talks of the relationship have come out, he has seemingly shown more of an appetite for at least some of these entities to investigate the DA and kind of look into this relationship to see if anything improper happened. He's not on the front lines beating the drum saying that the DA should be removed from this case, but it is notable that he at least is willing to have others investigate it for now. But as I said, he's going to be a star witness whenever this trial is going to happen, because he'd gotten called by Donald Trump in the aftermath of the 2020 election and can speak a lot to the president and what he was being asked to do at that time.
It's going to be so interesting to watch. It's kind of like the Super Bowl. We're in the pregame window right now. We're waiting for this game to actually happen. There's so much that you guys are covering. This is why we have folks like you on the program. Tamar Hallerman, like I mentioned, fantastic reporter over at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Go check out that podcast, Breakdown. What a good name, Breakdown, right? It's got like a great name. It's got the AJC logo. Go check out all her work over there at ajc.com. Thank you so much, Tamar, for coming on the program. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.